Let me now introduce the founder of Seatopia, James Arthur Smith, who is a fascinating guy. He started his journey in regenerative aquaculture as a teenager, gaining experience by breeding steelhead trout. And he's my hero because he did what I still hope someday I'll do. He sailed the Pacific for a decade, visiting aquaculture farms and connecting them to California restaurants. And then finally in 2020, what good timing. What else happened in 2020? Oh yeah, that COVID thing. In any event, in 2020, he founded Seatopia, which he's now going to tell you all about. Please welcome James Arthur Smith to the stage.
Thank you, Terry. And in case you guys don't know, Terry also has been thinking a lot and acting on restoring the Santa Monica Bay and San Pedro since his time founding the Santa Monica Bay Keepers. And part of their mission was really restoration of these waters. And this is such a beautiful version of this iteration as we continue to pool resources and create mechanisms to rehabilitate our waters. So yeah, my name is James Arthur Smith, and as Terry indicated, I spent a lot of time on the ocean. Spent almost 10 years living on a sailboat. I've had the good fortune of being able to sail from here all the way to the Galapagos Islands on a small sailboat. Seen a lot of amazing things. I've had the opportunity to hug and kiss a gray whale and spend time with humpback whales and whale sharks and toothy sharks and all kinds of amazing experiences. Spent a lot of time in our local waters diving in the kelp forest, and I was in the kelp forest taking photos of my friends and of the beautiful light that comes through the kelp forest on a clear sunny day when we had our last big El Nino warming spell. It was amazing. We were out in the kelp forests with just our swimsuits on, swimming in this, 70-something degree water, crystal clear sunny days, having just the time of our lives. Just some of the most beautiful experiences that I've had in California. And the photos that we have from this day are so unique because you see people without wetsuits just diving in this beautiful environment, the way the colors of light illuminate kelp. It's so beautiful. But what we didn't totally grasp at the time was that incredible warming experience that we were having was also a tipping point in the health of our kelp forests. The water was so warm that a lot of the kelp has not recovered. So our kelp forest went from being very, very dense and incredible breeding grounds and spawning grounds and nurseries for myriad species, from our white sea bass and our local yellowtail. There's so many species that really depend on these kelp forests. These kelp forests are the lungs of our oceans, the lungs of the planet, the nurseries for all these organisms, but when they're not healthy, our oceans aren't healthy. And when the oceans aren't healthy, we have, we're part of that. We are part of nature. We came from the oceans. We are not, this is a beautiful photo and a beautiful statement. Our future is blue, but our past is also blue. Our genetics, we all come from, we have prefrontal cortexes because of marine algae. DHA is directly linked to our evolutionary path, history, and our future. So when I'm taking a breath right now, every other breath is oxygen from microalgae and some from the macroalgae as well. As much as 50% of the oxygen on this planet comes from algae. So when we call this planet Earth, we are still carrying on this tradition of short-sightedness, thinking that we're on a flat planet and Earth is what we see. But when we went to space, we saw that this was a blue planet, and it was blue, uniquely blue. It should be called ocean. It should not be called Earth. Earth is a misnomer from a time when we didn't have the perspective that we have today. So we have this opportunity to be alive because of the oceans, and in great part because of kelp. So Seatopia is a project that I've been working on for a few years to help support the oceans, because they mean a lot to me, not just because I like to breathe oxygen, but because I've created my whole life connected to the ocean. I feel personally most alive when I'm in the church of the ocean, when I'm connected to the ocean, when I have that blue mind experience. If you guys haven't read Blue Mind, it's a fantastic book. Rest in peace. The author of that book just recently passed away, but it inspired me and many other people in this room, I know. I like kelp for a lot of reasons. We've talked about a lot of those. But if you gave me the choice to eat a plate of kelp or a plate of sushi that was, sushi grade salmon, for example, or steelhead trout, most of us would probably choose kelp, would choose the seafood, because kelp is just a little harder to digest for some people. It's not as attractive. When I eat fish, I actually feel alive. I feel vital. I feel like there's a direct exchange of energy. It's bioavailable. For me, it works well. For some people, it's different. But the levels of EPA and DHA from fish and from the Mediterranean diet, it's demonstrated in many, many studies to have an association to heart health and mental health. In so many ways, all these blue zones had seafood as an integral part of it. So Seatopia is an interesting business that we've created, thanks in part to AltaSea, that is creating the catalyst to produce seafood in a more responsible way with the ocean. How do we catalyze the ecosystem services of kelp and shellfish in symbiotic relation to the fish that we like to eat as well? In nerdy terms, we call it Integrated Multitrophic Aquaculture. Integrated Multitrophic Aquaculture, or IMTA, is really just a fancy way of saying it's multiple species growing symbiotically together. On land, we've created massive monocultures of corn, of cattle. We do these factory farms, monocultures, because we know how to control nature. But the outcomes of that are all these externalities like pollution and inhumane practices and food that is not really healthy for human consumption. But when we look at other models of regenerative farming, of polyculture farming, where we actually try to learn from what nature has taught us, that there are relations between the grasses and the microbes, as Emily was talking about, and the ruminant animals that roam across those plains. In the ocean, we're learning this as well. Just like Emily was talking about, the microbes have a very important relation to the microbiome of the kelp. And the kelp has a very important relation to shellfish and to fish. In farms, there's a stigma against farmed fish that a lot of people are familiar with, that fish poop is bad for the environment. Well, fish poop is actually a superfood. It's a nutrient. It just depends on what are those components that you're feeding that fish. If you're feeding that fish GMO corn and antibiotics and hormones, I agree with you 100%. But how do we cultivate fish with clean feed so that we can actually have a beautiful fertilizer? Because one of the things that we talked about with kelp is it wants phosphorus and nitrogen and ammonia, and those components are actually found in fish poop. So integrated multitrophic aquaculture is this thing where we're actually creating symbiotic relationships between fish and shellfish and kelp and microbes and deposit feeders, and learning how to cultivate and farm in a different way. Not a monoculture, not thinking that we know how to control nature, but learning from nature, from the billions of years of evolution and how these organisms have evolved, with EPA and DHA at the base of this system, fueling the whole system. So today we're working with some farms that are feeding fish EPA and DHA from microalgae. Not feeding fish with other fish, not feeding fish with corn and soy and antibiotics, but raising microalgae, because they're the source of the EPA and DHA in fish. When you think about a fish and its health benefits, it's the EPA and DHA, and fish don't have a biological mechanism producing the quantities of EPA and DHA that we associate them with. It comes through bioaccumulating through the food chain. So you can actually grow these microalgae and feed them to the fish. And then you grow some proteins like soldier fly larvae, and you pair this together to produce a healthy feed input. And then as long as you have a symbiotic partnership, you understand what the feed conversion ratio is of the fish. Fish are going to eat a certain amount and they're going to poop a certain amount. Well, then you pair those with other organisms like your kelp that are going to absorb the dissolved particulates, and you have your shellfish like your mussels and your oysters and your scallops, and then your bottom feeders, and all of a sudden you're creating an ecosystem. And that's what we're trying to do with Seatopia today, is support this innovation in how we work with the ocean. Not to build industrial scale factory farms, but to develop a relationship that can be regenerative. How do we have a net positive impact on our relationship to the ocean? Not only at the farm, but a whole impact. There's also been some challenges with farming in the ocean, because near coastal environments we don't necessarily have the space or the right or the privilege. But there's over 70% of the ocean is what we call olotrophic, low nutrient, offshore deep environment surfaces, where there's not actually enough nutrients to grow kelp or shellfish. But we could potentially introduce nutrients to those environments, and that's a really beautiful vision for the future of our relationship, is offshore farming in multitrophic environments, because kelp, shellfish, and finfish symbiotically in offshore environments could create abundance to feed this planet. It would take less than 5% of the coastline to feed the entire world's population of proteins, if done right, also have a net positive impact. These sort of farms that we're working with today that have a net positive impact in the environment are creating increasing biodiversity in that ecosystem by creating habitat, by creating places for spawning organisms to come and hide, and sequestering carbon. Because every time a shell from a shellfish like oyster or a scallop is being created, it's actually pulling carbon out of the ocean. It's helping offset ocean acidification. If we can scale these sort of systems and scale the ecosystem services that they provided, Emily talked about $500 billion of ecosystem services. How do we place a value on that and scale those systems? Because the ocean is, as some people know, the largest carbon sink, but we need to also offset that carbon. Offsetting ocean acidification and scaling these systems is very important. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I'm going to point over here and see what happens. I didn't prepare a deck. This is something else they gave me. My wife's at home 9 months pregnant, due any minute, so here's a slide. That's our boat when we were sailing around. That's me visiting a farm. I spent many years at this farm in the Sea of Cortez, swimming in. This is a photo from a place in the Sea of Cortez that's a marine protected area that I've swam at many times, but had the exact same vibes and experience inside of a fish farm. Because inside of a farm where the fish are in a deep water, low density environment, it's the same experience. Crystal clear water, thousands of fish swimming around, tons of space, usually a ratio of 2% fish, 98% water. Imagine around that, kelp and shellfish. It's a beautiful environment, very different than a factory farm. The mission of Seatopia is to create a regenerative seafood supply chain, innovative aquaculture products, contributing to ocean reforestation. We also plant kelp with every single order because kelp farming and the reforesting of our oceans is not inexpensive, and we don't want these projects to just always be dependent on grants and handouts. Seatopia is a market-based solution to actually help plant more kelp. We planted over 7,500 kelp this season alone. That's a kelp forest. Kelp forests are pretty cool. They draw down 50 times more carbon than regular forests and produce oxygen. Let's do more of that. I've talked to some people on podcasts. We have a chef here that made some beautiful food today that's from farms that are doing things right. If I leave you with one thing today, it's that aquaculture is really cool and interesting, and farming fish is still an evolving relationship that we're learning about. You know, aquaculture in general, let's talk about salmon for a second, only started in the 70s. It's evolving significantly. It went from feeding salmon with bait fish to feeding salmon with corn and soy to where we are today, feeding them with algae and soldier fly larvae. This is sort of 3.0, and it's really cool. So not all farms are this way. There's a huge market for commodity farms. Most farms are still going to produce commodity product because most people aren't asking, hey, what did that fish eat? But if you start asking those questions, how was it farmed and what did it eat, and maybe what did it eat, you will be driving demand towards better farming practices. Just like we saw with cattle and chicken, where 10 years ago people just wanted USDA prime, but today we're asking for grass-fed, grass-finished, pasture-raised, regenerative practices. We can do the same thing with aquaculture. We can develop regenerative, scalable food systems. But it requires us not to be complacent. It requires us to ask those questions about where our food came from and have a connection to that. So, I'd invite you guys to go and visit our little booth over there. We have a chef serving some sushi-grade fish and kelp and maybe some scallops. It's all part of this system of asking where your food came from and what it ate, and having a meaningful relationship to the ocean and to your food. That's all I've got, but Emily, I think you should come up here and we should do, I think, a Q&A.
I'm lucky enough to be his neighbor over there in Berth 57, as well as Emily's. So he's educated me a lot about sustainable seafood and farm seafood. I think, like a lot of people, didn't realize there's really good farm seafood. Can you explain what you explained to me about the amino acids in the salmon I sampled a while ago that blew my mind?
I don't remember the conversation.
I had never had farmed salmon before, and you explained why this particular, it was actually king salmon, why this was really good.
Well, quality in fish is a really amazingly complicated thing, because the long chain amino acids of fish, which we all crave, they're very fragile. They oxidize very quickly. And that's why most people who say they don't like fish because it's fishy, they just haven't had good fish. You know, it's very difficult to preserve and not let those fish oxidize. One of the things that causes oxidation is stress and lactic acid. And if a fish is harvested or caught in a way that's stressful, it's going to have high levels of lactic acid, and it's going to be more likely to oxidize, and it's going to taste fishy. So the way fish are harvested is possibly what we were talking about. There's so many different ways to kill fish that are inhumane and terrible and result in fishy fish. Most people are familiar with that. But we work with some farms, for example, that are focused so much on preserving the health and life and value and energy of that animal that they go to the extent of harvesting the fish in as low stressful way as possible to minimize lactic acid. And not just because they want to be nice, humane people, because it has a material and noticeable effect on the quality and the taste of the product. Some of these technologies and techniques were developed in Japan where there's such awesome nerds about these things. For example, there's a farm we work with that goes to the pens and has basically a giant vacuum that the fish swim up and into the live well tank of a boat. And that live well tank is pumped at a super high oxygen level. And that the highly oxygenated water causes the fish to just completely relax. They're at this relaxed state. And then they swim into a little canal, and one at a time, in this relaxed state, they get this ikejime process. It's a process that just immediately spikes the brain, spikes the nerve, or destroys the nerve, and then they get taken down the line and they bleed them out very quickly to remove the blood and lactic acid out of the fish as quickly as possible, optimizing for preserving the fragile amino acids of the fish and the long chain fatty acids of fish. So that could be what we were talking about. So if you just throw a fish onto the deck and let it suffocate, it's going to taste fishy real quick. If you fought that fish on a hook and line for a long time, it's going to taste fishy likely very quickly. So the way we harvest fish, optimizing for humane practices, also has a material effect on quality. Maybe that's what we're talking about.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I, as a consumer, am wondering, how do we get to participate in eating such quality fish? Because over the years, I've gotten further away from eating fish because of it being farmed or fear of where it's being harvested.
I was in that boat as well. There was a period of time I stopped eating fish because I didn't want to condone practices that I had seen firsthand were destructive. I've witnessed things in the ocean that I can't condone. Fortunately, enough of our community has said, hey, we want access to those same fish that for years we used to harvest these fish and sell them to the best Michelin star restaurants in the United States. And since COVID, we switched to selling direct to consumers. I'll be honest, this is not inexpensive fish. There's more intention and higher costs that go into producing these fish. But I can also tell you we lab test all of them, and we have quantifiable data on the levels of mercury and microplastics and omega-3s in them. So you have a predictable experience, and people can buy Seatopia delivered to their door. And you can also use an HSA account to pay for it. Seatopia is a qualified HSA expense, so in California we save like 30% there if you use your HSA to purchase it. So Seatopia.fish.
Hi there. Thank you both for your presentations. This is for James. I just wanted to ask if you could talk about the difference between offshore farms that have these various techniques and doing polyspecies farms and things like tidal areas like lagoons and or onshore. And if you've seen examples of that and success and different things like that.
Absolutely. There's no one model that is the only model. There's very place-based solutions. there's a wonderful TED Talk that Dan Barber did called I Fell in Love with a Fish, or How I Fell in Love with a Fish. It's worth looking up, about a farm called Vete La Palma in Spain, where they took a degraded estuary. Estuaries are such important parts of our ecosystem. A lot of fish come up into the estuaries to breed and spawn, and the estuaries play an important role in converting nutrients. Vete La Palma also became, after being this degraded, drained estuary, became a huge cattle farm. Unfortunately, some people came and took over that farm and removed the cattle and reflooded the waters and created this estuary again that became a haven for flamingos and many, many species of birds, and phytoplankton and zooplankton attracted so many more species. And they approached managing this from the perspective of, how do we grow microalgae? How do we grow phytoplankton and zooplankton, and everything else will grow from there? Vete La Palma today is no longer commercially active, but the story continues with a project called Esteros Lobino that we're working with today, and is an amazing example of working in intercoastal tidal zones to grow zooplankton and phytoplankton as the base food source for the fish and the shrimp. And this is what is often referred to as extensive farming. So we also work with some shrimp farmers, for example, that don't have to feed the shrimp. Similar to Vete La Palma, it's not about putting feed into the waters to feed the fish. It's about creating an environment where the phytoplankton and the zooplankton feed the organisms. So these shrimp farmers that we're working with have been contracted to reforest these mangroves, these intercoastal mangroves. And by protecting the mangroves, they also are able to release a native species of shrimp into these tidal lagoons, and at high tides they allow the water to congregate in a certain pool where they'll harvest these shrimp that they didn't feed at all. They're literally just extensively foraging the zooplankton and phytoplankton in there, and as a result you have this beautiful, beautiful products, whether that's the shrimp or the striped bass or the lobinos. There's extensive farms around the world that should be celebrated. This is a wonderful example of an alternative to industrial scale factory farming. And then there's another type of farming it's worth mentioning. That's referred to as RAS, or recirculating aquaculture systems, land-based farms. In the United States, we have a lot of land-based farms, RAS projects, because it's oftentimes all we've been able to get permitted. Similar to like hothouse tomatoes, growing things indoors. You're able to control the environment, control the outcomes, but hothouse tomatoes don't always taste as good as tomatoes grown in the ground, but they're still cool because you can grow them in the city on the rooftop, and they're scalable food systems. So yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Let's give James and Emily a great big round of applause. Thank you.